Hello and welcome to the Reorg, where we dive into the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute archives and re-examine old ideas after years of accumulated proof of work. This is your host, Michael Goldstein, also known as Bitstein, and joining me as always is my co-host, Pierre Rochard. Pierre, how are you?
Doing very well. Feeling euphoric.
Yes, number go up. As I've tweeted out, it's a feeling of, that nature is healing. And the whole economy is repricing itself around a better monetary standard. It's definitely something to be euphoric about. So today, we're continuing our journey through the S&I mempool crash course. Last week, we spoke a bit about the so-called image problem of Bitcoin. And today, we're going to be continuing on that topic with an article called How to Market Bitcoin. And this article was written April 26, 2014. The price was about $459. And let's just hop right in. How Bitcoin adoption works. Does Bitcoin need to be sanitized and separated from its anarchist black market roots in order to become acceptable to the general population? Must Bitcoin become an upstanding citizen and saddle itself with KYC requirements and capital controls? Absolutely not. Those making this argument totally misunderstand the way that Bitcoin adoption will proceed and are consequently wrong-headed about how to market it. The most important rule of the economics of Bitcoin is that investment creates liquidity and liquidity creates value. The more liquid that Bitcoin becomes, the more trade it can absorb, and the more it can be used as a medium of exchange, and the easier it will become to profit from a Bitcoin-based service. There, is that clear? Bitcoin becomes more useful the more people invest in it. This is the key to understanding the economics of Bitcoin. If this insight was understood, then I would not need to write another article. From a marketing perspective, this means that Bitcoin becomes easier to market the bigger it gets, because the bigger it gets, the more people can benefit from it. Someone who needs Bitcoin a little bit now will need Bitcoin a lot in the future. People who don't need Bitcoin at all right now may soon start needing it. And people who already need Bitcoins are going to be desperate for it in the future. Furthermore, there is no end to this process. Bitcoin investment necessarily comes at the expense of other currencies, so even as Bitcoin gets better, its competitors get worse. It does not matter how much or how irrationally someone hates Bitcoin. Eventually, it will become so much more useful than the currency he normally uses that he will have to switch right up to the day that Paul Krugman demands to be paid in Bitcoin to write another article denouncing it. Bitcoin will force people to love it. Thus, Bitcoin need never seek mass appeal. To do so is to waste resources on people who are not yet ready for it. There is always someone out there who so obviously needs Bitcoin that it is a no-brainer to get on board. Anyone not desperate can be ignored until they become desperate. There may not be many people like that at any given time, but they will never run out. Mycelium recently released a commercial called Mycelia in Wonderland, which is pretty much my favorite commercial in history. It is so obviously not trying to appeal to normal people. I love everything about it, especially the way that it likens entering the Bitcoin world to a psychedelic experience or going through a portal to another universe, because that's exactly how I feel. This cartoon is exactly what the Bitcoin world is like. It was great because I was just writing this article when it came out, and it was about the most perfect Bitcoin commercial that I could possibly imagine, and I almost died laughing. Now, there's a lot that I agree and disagree with here. I agree that, the basic macro of Bitcoin is ultimately what drives it the most. But I would also disagree in the sense of I think it's right that Bitcoin doesn't need to seek mass appeal in the way that certain people kind of frame that idea. But I don't think that means that we shouldn't market Bitcoin in a way that could potentially have mass appeal. That is to say, you don't have to, market Bitcoin in a way like this commercial he was raving about, which I have not watched. And I did not watch in preparation for this. I think I probably saw it when it came out, but, having this like strange psychedelic experience or whatever, that actually doesn't even appeal to me. And it doesn't necessarily appeal to anyone. And I don't know that you have to have a purposefully, unpopular look for Bitcoin. But the idea of wanting mass appeal in the way that a lot of people do think about it, I do think has its flaws in the sense that there's a few things. First, there's this idea that people have in their heads, for instance, about a mythical average person. And so they tend to just come up with this abstract concept in their head of what an average person is. And then they judge everything based on this thing in their head, as opposed to how people actually respond. Not every average person has exactly the same motivations and desires in the world. They all have, kind of different walks of life that they're dealing with. And so, when people talk about mass appeal, it's usually looking at this just average person abstracted figure that, in fact, I don't even think it helps you tap in to real people's needs. And so that's an issue, because I think a lot of normal people actually have become Bitcoiners because they've found that it's useful, even for just something like, number go up, which is a perfectly reasonable reason to be interested in Bitcoin.
Yeah, I agree. And even to this day, we still hear people complaining about how Bitcoin is being marketed, where, for example, Michael Saylor's AI generated images, saw some that were controversial, one where he generated an image of himself as the Pope, or a bishop or a cardinal. I don't know which one specifically, but you've got folks who are like, oh, that crossed the line and this is like bad for Bitcoin. And then others who are like, hey, it's just funny. And so
the president of the United States also took a similar marketing approach for his own political campaigning. So,
well, yeah. And, not to state my own opinion on either of these, but the point being that clearly there's going to be different strokes for different folks. It's not everyone's cup of tea. And that Bitcoin's marketing being decentralized, you're going to have a combination of like very polished corporate presentation of Bitcoin. So I'd point to, for example, BlackRock's marketing for their Bitcoin ETF. Like, they talk about, oh, there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoin, but they don't really present it as a psychedelic experience.
Right. And then there's people who they want psychedelic experiences. And there's certainly a way of talking about Bitcoin in a way that has a psychedelic veneer, or, kind of speaks to that mindset.
We always say going down the rabbit hole. Right.
Yes. Yeah. Very good point. So you flip on the Jefferson airplane and, really get to talking about the crazy possibilities for cognitive expansion and consciousness and so on. Like you could do that with Bitcoin, but that's also only going to appeal to one market. And we have a very large market with very different cohorts.
My favorite Bitcoin marketing is when it's related to the Matrix. So orange pilling, there's the one where he's asking Neo, or Neo's asking, when do I sell? And then the response is that you don't sell, you're going to spend it, which is, like this idea of like store value to medium of exchange. And then the one where instead of there's no spoon, it's there's no top.
Yes.
Yeah. Lots of great material has come out of the Matrix, which I don't know that was the intention of the creators of the Matrix to provide marketing material for Bitcoin, but
I think that's exactly what they were going for. And that's why they also created V for Vendetta, because they knew that would appeal to Bitcoin marketers as well. For a different, cohort that they could work with. We haven't seen any Speed Racer memes, but I guess that also flopped, if I remember correctly.
That's your opportunity. Their flop is your opportunity.
Yeah, I don't even think I saw it.
No.
But yeah, well, I think that meme also is just it's kind of this implication that in the future there won't be dollars to spend, or no one will accept dollars anyway, so you'll have to use Bitcoin. This is something I've actually really liked about Michael Saylor's marketing, which quite clearly does not appeal to everyone. But one of the techniques that he has, and I like to think of him as a boomer whisperer, and I think this was best on display. I believe I think it was when he was on Tucker Carlson's show for an hour. And he has this extraordinary ability to come up with just metaphor after metaphor. And this drives a lot of people who want to be very literal and precise with their Bitcoin explanations, which I totally understand as well. I'm a huge stickler for economic terminology, for instance. But he'll come up with all of these different metaphors from, Bitcoin is digital property, it's digital energy, it's, this and that. And it's almost like he just was putting them out knowing that one of those metaphors is going to stick. So it's like if you just paint 50 different pictures of Bitcoin, one of them is going to look good and speak to whoever's listening. And so and you don't always know which one. So sometimes you can do a kind of spray it mentality and see what sticks. And I think he's been very good at that. And frankly, some of his metaphors have really shaped kind of the way that I think about Bitcoin, or has given me some new ways to kind of conceptualize even things that I already know about Bitcoin. Talking about, there's one on, I think it was Lex Friedman or something, one of his 4-hour podcasts. And, he was talking about, he loves the metaphor of, Manhattan Island, but he talks about the different frequencies of different people operating on Manhattan Island, and Bitcoin basically just buying Bitcoin and holding it as being the person who owns the physical land. But on top of that land, you have skyscrapers, you have large buildings. Some of those buildings have nightclubs in them. In those nightclubs, you have you have the club owners, you have the promoters, you have, just the consumers that are just there for a good time, and so on and so forth. So each of these people, he was describing it as sort of being on a different frequency. And in a physical, engineering standpoint, he's talking about, frequency in terms of like the time dimension. So the lower frequency is effectively like a lower time preference, longer time horizon. But each one of those people that's operating on a different frequency is able to build on this bedrock. And I think that some people might not like the engineering metaphors, but for me, that actually was very, very interesting to think about how economies, and especially like a sound money economy, a Bitcoin economy, allows all of these people to work together. And that real like building on Bitcoin is building an economy of that sort that is able to use the monetary trade as this basis for exchange between all of these different people with different needs, different time preferences, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like it's a huge improvement. So I've always had this theory of when people come to Bitcoin, they come to it with the baggage of whatever their background is. And so, not too long ago, it was like, hey, if you come from the world, I don't know, medicine, you're like, oh, well, we can use the Bitcoin technology, blockchain technology for medical records. Non-metaphorically, right? I have not heard Saylor metaphorically refer to Bitcoin as a database for medical records, but I think that would actually be a valuable metaphor. So when I came to Bitcoin, I had this background of accounting and monetary economics. And so there's really no metaphor, right? Because that's literally what it is. And so I feel like maybe I lack the creativity that Saylor's engineering background brings to the conversation.
Yes, and my sense of his engineering background also is one where he's touched so many sort of levels of the stack. Everything from, I want to say he did aerospace engineering, so
that's
he's
right.
dealing with like
Rockets.
very mission critical engineering tasks to running a giant public corporation for decades, which has all of the sort of financial things that are layered on making that engineering possible.
I think he's also like very widely read. He reads a lot of books, and that's how he got orange pilled reading the Bitcoin Standard from Saifedean, from what I understand.
Yes, I mean it's actually really impressive that and then Saifedean's like, hey, you should read Rothbard, and he goes and he chooses like Rothbard's History of Economic Thought and Conceived in Liberty, which are each over 1,000 pages of material, and he reads them and has a lot of very, very interesting takeaways from it. So huge props to him on that. I think that is relevant here. This article, this was written by Daniel Krawisz, and he was coming from a very ideological anarcho-capitalist worldview, and that was what was drawing him into Bitcoin as far as I can tell. And I mean, it very much influenced my own interest in Bitcoin as well. And so naturally, there's more of an interest in some of these extra legal aspects of Bitcoin. And I do think that it helps push back against some of the unfortunate, legal views of Bitcoin. So for instance, here, there's sort of a reference in a sense, if we see, must Bitcoin become an upstanding citizen and saddle itself with KYC requirements and capital controls? In some way, you can kind of read that as, it's like, do we need to believe that the legitimacy of Bitcoin comes from the state? That is like chartalism. And, I think we'd agree that that's a resounding no. And people should not be thinking of the government as the one that creates Bitcoin legitimacy. But I would caveat that in the sense that the development of regulation, whether we like said regulation or not, it does, for one, it shapes a lot of people's ideas because they are in heavily regulated industries. And so they are dependent on that in order to participate in certain things. But the fact that there is development of regulation does show just how legitimate Bitcoin is. So it's more like Bitcoin's legitimacy creates a need to create regulatory frameworks within the context of government, rather than government regulation being that which creates the Bitcoin legitimacy.
Yeah, I think people get it twisted, and then they're upset when like Bitcoiners are celebrating that the government is making Bitcoin legal tender or is adding Bitcoin to their reserves.
Yes. Let's go ahead and continue on. The black market. Mycelium in Wonderland is clearly aimed at people who want to buy drugs, which is good because Bitcoin's success on the black market is more meaningful and a more significant test of Bitcoin's viability. The more that Bitcoin handles illicit activity, the better. People need illicit stuff a lot more because the more you tell someone that something he wants is evil or that he doesn't deserve to have it, the more desperate he is to get it. Someone who wants Bitcoin for drugs or porn will tend to be a more loyal and committed Bitcoin proponent than someone who uses it to buy shoes. Therefore, Bitcoin should not be shy about the black market. Black market businesses should be seen as potential early adopters. I will be more convinced that Bitcoin's place is secure when drug cartels start using it than when Amazon.com starts accepting it. Use on the black market does nothing to change the pattern of Bitcoin adoption I described above. The people who most need Bitcoin at each stage of adoption will not care about its association with illicit activity. They will care about how it improves their profits. There is no reason to treat the black market as something shameful. It is a source of wealth that we all depend on, directly or indirectly. If you love Bitcoin and foresee yourself growing rich off of it, then you should love its black market uses as well. If you cannot bring yourself to embrace the black market, then perhaps Bitcoin is not for you. Every time I hear someone complain about Bitcoin's black market uses, I feel a twinge of pain. I want only to nurture Bitcoin, and I love everything that makes Bitcoin good as an investment, not only that which is considered socially acceptable. And we talked about this a bit last time. And I argue that there is something to be said about Bitcoin sort of proving its worth, in kind of highly adversarial conditions, in that, being able to survive in the black market, it requires being a good medium of exchange. You're not going to last long using like a bad medium of exchange. Most of the illicit activity, as far as I know, uses dollars, which obviously we have major issues with as a good medium of exchange, but it is the sort of the best medium of exchange in the sense of being the most liquid good. They're not doing black market activity in some altcoin made by some tiny central bank in some third world country or something.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. So I think that I would disagree with a bit of this article, and I think this section. I think this is very much coming from a particular worldview in a particular context of 2014. But today, I would actually be much more excited with Amazon accepting Bitcoin. I would be even more excited about Amazon deciding to put it on their balance sheet. But we can even see how excited people are about Steak and Shake. They have been going all in on Bitcoin in the sense of accepting it at all locations across the country, and they've been leaning into Bitcoin excitement, as well as sort of adjacent memes and interests like beef tallow, and that obviously that is exciting for people, and I don't see why it wouldn't be. And at this point, drug cartels using it, in some sense, it would I don't even think it would be like interesting anymore.
Well, what I found interesting in being in these kind of public policy conversations about the illegal use of Bitcoin, criminals are a high time preference, and they don't want to hold Bitcoin. They want to convert into dollars as quickly as possible. And that's how they end up getting their Bitcoin seized. They deposit in an exchange, and then their account gets frozen, and then they can't convert into dollars. Or they want to use a stable coin, on Tron, and they don't care about Bitcoin at all. And so I think that this idea of Bitcoin's great for criminals, it's not that great for criminals because they're not long-term savers. So on top of the fact that to the extent that, Steak and Shake and the beef tallow and Bitcoin being interrelated, it's like, okay, if Bitcoin causes a cultural change towards greater health, I don't know of a whole lot of black market activity that's oriented towards greater health. And if it helps,
usually the opposite.
Usually, generally speaking, the opposite. Maybe there's some exceptions of the FDA wouldn't approve this cancer treatment, and so
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, like Buyers Club type stuff.
Yeah. So, the exception that proves the rule. But, generally, if Bitcoin helps reorient black markets towards instead of spending my money on cocaine, I'm going to save my money in Bitcoin because, I've learned about it from that. Then if Bitcoin can help get rid of black markets and help, bring these poor souls back into the light, then that's good. But to the extent that it ruins people's lives, that's bad.
Yes, I think that sort of makes sense with the high time preference, and that is something to consider. It's like a lot of people being drawn to the black market, especially somewhere like the United States, where we can generally get our hands on what we need pretty easily without the black market. The high levels of risk entailed by the black market is almost, it kind of is high time preference relative to wanting to just have a stable business, even if it's one that, has high costs of doing business because of taxation and so on and so forth. Because, knowing you can walk free and be able to, earn money, is just going to be generally a better long-term play. But that's obviously not without, it's costs. Like we face extreme regulatory burdens and high taxation and so on and so forth. So it's not like everything is great, but the high risks, especially, spending your life in prison for something that doesn't help you earn money or take care of your family. So that does have to be considered.
Right. Like,
oh yeah.
You're not, if you're just a junkie, shooting up heroin, using the black market for that. And then, somebody asks you, why are you doing that? And you're like, well, I'm an agorist. I'm trying to bring down the government. Like, what?
And if you want to get very tinfoil, a lot of black market activity is also going to have, various connections to, government black ops of sorts. So even if you've risen to some level of like having some black market, kingdom or something, it's like you're still just like operating with the system, and then maybe you're either helping them, or there's like a Baptist and bootleggers type situation where you have like a codependence because your existence benefits the government's ability to come up with reasons to make things more onerous, like they did with post 9/11 security state type stuff, because we have to fight the terrorists. So it's not even clear that the sort of black market stuff is going to be making an effect on improving things. Whereas I think we can make a pretty strong case that, Bitcoin itself, by putting it into savings and being able to hold it long term, does improve the chances of actually putting an end to central banking, which is sort of the prime money spigot for out of control government growth.
Yeah, I agree. I like the idea of the guy who's like, I'm taking down the system by buying my cocaine from the CIA. Like, oh, wow. Oh, but don't worry, it's not KYC. Okay.
Yeah. Which, I mean, even with that, I do want to note this is one good reason to accept Bitcoin at your business, because if you can make something that is worth people giving up their sats, that money is not KYC'd. KYC has to do with dollars, not Bitcoin, so to speak.
That's right. The other, on the Bitcoin side, probably the most absurd statement I've heard, and I've heard I'm going to call him out by name here because he's a good friend, Giacomo, say this, like, there's no utility to Bitcoin outside of the black market. And I've heard that statement as well from Eric Voskuil. I think that statement is absurd, because when I push back on Giacomo on this, because to me the biggest censorship that's going on is not that of transactions for illegal goods and services. Rather, it's for savings. And so, inflation is the government censoring people's ability to save, and that holding Bitcoin is a completely legal, I guess we use the word white market, allowed market functionality that, allows you to bypass the censorship of the government without any risk of going to prison. And so, his response to that was, yeah, but you could just hold gold. And I'm like, have you not listened to any of my podcasts? There's lots of problems with gold. So
Giacomo said that?
yeah, I'll send you the link. It was I don't know if he was being kind of being the devil's advocate, or if he's really attached to this position of you should hold gold claims on gold held in vaults in Switzerland, which...
Well, I do know that he actually does view savings as sort of as his broad use of the term black market includes simply being able to save.
Okay, I was in an argumentative mood on that day because I was taken aback. I was like, Giacomo, you would take this position?
Giacomo is great at argumentative moods, which is also why I like him. He's one of my favorite Bitcoiners, and part of that has to do with he does have a drive for purity, which includes this sort of very, very pure anarcho-capitalist thing, and I think that it is very good to have around as a sort of countervailing force, as an interlocutor to help keep the ideas in check and kind of work between that. So I'm very grateful that we can have a friend who is able to
adversarial thinking.
Yes, and in good faith. So I'm glad we have him around. But to make these arguments,
in relation to the article, I'd really say, like, I don't think any Bitcoiners should be involved in any black market activities in any way. And I think that it's a lot more constructive to be involved in lobbying and public policy work to, move Bitcoin forward in a constructive manner with the government, which, I couldn't imagine myself saying that 10 years ago. But here we are. The proof is in the pudding, in my opinion.
But something you did say over 10 years ago, you had a great article working and saving a revolutionary axe.
Yeah.
So other activities that Bitcoiners are doing, just literally holding Bitcoin, but also building businesses, both Bitcoin businesses, including the next treasury company, but also just any business that is earning a profit and putting those profits into Bitcoin. And actually treating Bitcoin as the denominator for those profits. That is a great way to actually move the needle forward, and you can do so with much less risk of government involvement in an especially nasty way. But you might also you might grow to a point where you do have to engage in various policy lobbying and such, just to have them not breathe down your neck.
Yeah, it's like, if somebody's like, oh, the government's going to ban Bitcoin and the government is controlled by corporations. And so, like, the response to that is like, oh, okay, well, let's set up some Bitcoin corporations.
Yes.
There's always a solution to any given problem. Like, let's do it.
Another treasury corporation.
Yeah.
I need to get to work on mine. Bitcoin makes an offer nobody can refuse. Furthermore, Bitcoin, the value proposition, cannot be separated from Bitcoin, the black market currency. Anything that is good at being money is good on the black market, and anything that makes Bitcoin less useful on the black market makes it less useful, period. That is because the black market is just the market. Good money doesn't know the difference between the white and the black market. All of the traditional properties of money that Bitcoin embodies so well, divisibility, portability, fungibility, and scarcity, make no reference to state law. This is why Bitcoin should not seek regulatory approval. Regulation would certainly tend to reduce without any corresponding benefit. Making Bitcoin less useful on the black market would require making it less decentralized, less anonymous, or grant its users less control over their money. Yet these are the very features that attract people to it. Bitcoin's great value is its individualism, which is indivisible, and until the Bitcoin community frankly recognizes this and wholeheartedly strives to nurture both its white and black market uses, then Bitcoin will always be ambivalent about itself and at risk of self-harm. The solution to Bitcoin's regulatory issues is simple. Ignore the entrepreneurs who are complaining about it. They are just trying to earn dollars. Someone who is trying to earn Bitcoins will be much more interested in the long-term future of Bitcoin and would prefer that Bitcoin not seek mainstream approval so as to achieve a more stunning victory later. And So there's a lot of different ways to go with this. Something I guess I'll start with is that, when you were talking about the value of public policy, lobbying, so on and so forth, I do want to make a distinction, which I think this much better applies to. We can make a distinction, and one side of it this does apply to better, which is what you're describing is actually going to policymakers and effectively educating them on understanding Bitcoin's great value because of its individualism, because of its decentralization, because of its all the features that it has, and basically petitioning them to not get in the way of Bitcoin being able to bring value, in our case, to the American populace. And so it's actually like a very, pro-freedom message. You're trying to lobby the government to, carve out basically regulations of itself from impeding on people's uses of Bitcoin. And I would like to make a distinction. Stuff that we were seeing a lot of at this time period, there was a lot of talk about this, was people wanting to go in a totally different way, which was, how do we get the government to actually regulate, like how do we set up a bit license, and how do we do all these things that make it more onerous to use Bitcoin? And that is something that really should be shamed. And this is why, one of the reasons, actually, and I think you'd agree, that someone like Brad Garlinghouse of XRP and Ripple has not had as much success anymore with his own lobbying efforts, because of the fact that his efforts were based on, for the longest time, trying to tell the government that Bitcoin mining's bad and so on and so forth. So use my altcoin. And actually things have moved in a direction where, there are a lot of politicians and policymakers who are interested in Bitcoin's freedom properties.
Yeah, that's right. And we also have to look at it of like, what is Daniel specifically talking about when it comes to like seeking regulatory approval? And this is incomprehensible today, but back then, there were people saying like, we need to build in AML KYC at the protocol layer in Bitcoin so that your Bitcoin node and the miners are, for lack of a better word, filtering out transactions that are not OFAC approved, right? Or like government approved. And so this is a way for Daniel to push back on that. I think though that you don't have to endorse black market use to push back on that. I think you can push back on that from just the architecture of the software engineering that would fail. It wouldn't work. And so you would, just fork the network and you wouldn't have accomplished anything. And so I think that it's presenting to policymakers, okay, well, you can't add KYC AML at the protocol level. So first of all, accept that reality that it's just impossible. And then next is, given that you cannot do that, do you want to ban Bitcoin in the United States and drive it into the black market, right? And Elizabeth Warren was like, yes, of course, but any other sane politician's like, well, no, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because people will they'll trade it offshore, right? They'll get a VPN, then they'll be on FTX and on, Mt. Gox. Let's just make sure that it's onshore so that people aren't getting rugged by foreign, exchanges that are not accountable to the legal system here in the US. And that, so even if you don't buy into, we need to have a, freedom money, sound money, and that's good, at least you can buy into, well, it would be more harmful to drive this underground than to just have it be, legitimately on the white market above ground here in the US and, within some kind of regulatory framework. And now that's where we are today. Now the debate is that regulatory framework around the legal business of buying and selling Bitcoin, is it too onerous or not, right? So like looking at the existing Bank Secrecy Act, KYC, AML laws, really interesting developments there that it is not impossible that the Supreme Court of the United States will strike down the third-party doctrine on which all of the KYC-AML apparatus relies on here in the U.S., in which case we would end up in a situation where, like, there's no AML KYC requirements and Bitcoin's completely legal, and, you know, there's no need to have a black market for things that are completely illegal. So I don't know if that logic, you know, I'm rambling at this point, but all this to say that I think that the conversation has progressed tremendously from where it was when this article was written.
Yes, I agree with that. And I think also something that has changed a lot since this article was written, which was at the time, most people did not think that the U.S. would be sort of the prime market for Bitcoin, because people would say, oh, well, you know, Bitcoin, the United States has basically, you know, a functioning banking system. It's obviously not exactly our favorite banking system, but it works for people. People get what they need. Whereas in other countries all around the world, especially, you know, Latin America and so on and so forth, these are places that deal with high rates of inflation, even more corrupt banking, and also less access to banking and so on and so forth. And so there's sort of an expectation that we would see Bitcoin, you know, hit it off in somewhere like Argentina at a faster rate than the United States. But at the same time, in the United States is extremely wealthy, and Bitcoin is sort of best, so to speak, for savings. And the United States is sitting on a lot of assets, and those assets are a melting ice cube in the Saylor terms. And so there actually was a naturally large market for Bitcoin in the United States. And so from that point of view, you know, the United States is somewhere where the black market is not something that is as necessary for general living. Whereas something like the black market, which, you know, we could just say is a, you know, markets unsanctioned by the government, so extra legal with regards to, you know, the government legal system. In other places around the world and at different times, the black market has been not just a you know, kind of maybe sort of like good thing. It was like a necessary thing. You see that in, you know, the Soviet Union, you know, North Korea and other, you know, extremely, you know, socialist and communist societies. They basically wouldn't be able to function without a black market. And so in those cases, Bitcoin, you know, actually does very much have a use for that. And I also, you know, God bless those people for finding ways around whatever is needed so they can get their basic needs in life. I know this was a big problem a couple of years back. There were issues in Nigeria, and Nigeria actually tried cracking down on Bitcoin pretty hard, but that only made it much more obvious how needed Bitcoin was in Nigeria. So there was actually quite a boon in Bitcoin use in Nigeria, which was naturally going to include some kind of, you know, unsanctioned market activity. So in extreme cases, people need it for their basic needs. For a great illustration, people should go watch the movie, the Terry Gilliam movie Brazil. And there's the Robert De Niro character Archibald Tuttle, who is a black market air conditioning repairman. And that is completely necessary because the government's incapable of giving you cool air. So you have to turn to these black market guys to get that. And there are unfortunately places in the world where that's necessary. But as it were, in the United States, it's not as needed. And that's, I think, part of why we have, you know, for listeners, I think it's obvious, like, we do have a very American-centric viewpoint because, you know, we're Americans. And for us, in our country, typically the black market is something that is for illicit activity, and mostly illicit activity that none of us are interested in. But that's not a universalizable statement. And But going back, the fact is in 2014, there was more of an expectation that Bitcoin would take off there. And I think that was I think many of us Bitcoiners underestimated just how much interest there would be in Bitcoin in the United States. And as I've said since, even 2% inflation is hyperinflation on a long enough time scale. So even people who are not experiencing major amounts of inflation feel the pinch of it and will naturally seek out more profitable ways to store their assets.
Well, and furthermore, then when you have that adoption and that demand, and then the Bitcoin price goes up, and you have traditional financial investments where you'll see famous fund managers brag about 20% returns, and meanwhile Bitcoin's hitting like, let's say, 50%, right, conservatively. Past performance is not an indication of future performance. It's not financial advice presented purely for entertainment purposes. But that attracts people who they don't even care about inflation. They're just trying to pick the fastest horse, and so they're like, oh, okay, all right, Bitcoin, that performs well financially, so I'm going to not invest in the stock market and I'm going to invest in Bitcoin instead. And then that's like here in the U.S. Well, we're arguably the wealthiest country in the world, so you got people with lots of disposable income and, investment assets. And so they can just rebalance their portfolio and pick up some Bitcoin and do so freely. And they're not even, they're not thinking about the black market at all. I'm reminded, too, there was a anti-Bitcoin, or let's call him a no-coiner, guy who was on X, formerly known as Twitter, and he was like, this is back I think like 2015 or something like that. He's like, Bitcoin is only useful for Chinese who are evading capital controls to get their money out of China. And, and my reaction to that is like, okay, so are you simping for the Communist Party here? Like, why would you not celebrate this? Why are you dismissive of it?
Yes, I mean, which also, I mean, people get mad about the foreign investment in United States real estate, and that's kind of the opposite. They're getting upset about it, but it's like, why is that happening? And so in your case, what you're describing, it's like, yeah, that's happening because you have an awful government imposing terrible capital controls that are impeding people's ability to earn a living and secure their wealth for their families. So naturally, they would find ways to get around it as they could. And then that also leads them to not just buying Bitcoin, but to buying up United States real estate and Canadian real estate and London real estate and so on and so forth. And that gets people mad again. But it's like, if people would just be buying Bitcoin instead to get around said capital controls or whatever uncertainties that they have to deal with, then all of these other things would be further demonetized, and we wouldn't have to worry about people investing in houses and then just leaving them empty, making it more expensive for locals to actually just have a place to live.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So hopefully everybody who's buying U.S. real estate can start selling it, and that way we all have a place to live affordably.
Yeah. So, I'd say, we should keep a keen eye on anywhere, where Bitcoin is able to remove these kinds of uncertainties, including places that we don't necessarily have an interest in or even condone. But as we've said many times, that doesn't mean you need to celebrate those things, but instead use it as an opportunity to revisit Bitcoin's fundamentals and celebrate Bitcoin's ability to deliver on those fundamentals, and then be able to describe, why those fundamentals are good for the rest of us who are not trying to engage in illicit behavior.
Yeah.
So, no compromises. Continuing on, no compromises. It should never be expected that Bitcoin will have approval from government and the banking industry for long. If Bitcoin continues to grow, then eventually Bitcoin will threaten the dollar itself, and then a government attack is inevitable. Regulation will only make Bitcoin more vulnerable when that time comes. However, because Bitcoin can resist all regulation no matter how draconian, it has no need to make compromises. Moreover, Bitcoin cannot compromise without risking its future, because competition between currencies is never stable. A successful free market currency must be good enough to defeat all the rest. If Bitcoin is ever less competitive than the dollar, it will die. Otherwise, it will destroy the dollar. Thus, there is no way to avoid a confrontation with the US government, no matter how many regulations Bitcoin obeys. Bitcoin investors had better be willing to see Bitcoin through to its total victory, because if it does not accomplish this, they will lose everything. Anyone who thinks this is impossible might want to sell out now. And this is something that we'll actually get to some of his brilliant articles from a few years later about how to think through the idea of governments attacking Bitcoin, but which I think have held up very well in very interesting ways. And from that perspective, we actually are seeing a lot of approval from governments and approval from the banking industry. So things have been a little different than a lot of Bitcoiners expected. Although in hindsight, I think it makes logical sense. It's not that it's not something broke. It's just that there are certain things that perhaps we didn't anticipate in the right way.
Yeah, I think government adoption is inevitable, which it really puts, and it's interesting. I mean, there's another article we're going to talk about the allure of Bitcoin, but I think even in that one, it really just pointed to the principal agent problem. But I think that there's like an even bigger principal agent problem, that is that the number of people in government who are actually aligned with the central bank is really quite limited. It's the 500 PhDs who work in the building. It's not like, I don't think the Congress, the executive branch, or the judiciary cares so much that they would turn it into a totalitarian society. And furthermore, that the voters would put up with that. And I think that's where, as libertarians, we often think of the government as Leviathan. It's the state. It has its own agenda. But I think it's a little more nuanced than that in democratic countries where, it can be that, but it can also be the case that the voters, want to vote for more liberty, and that especially if it's liberty that will make them money. And so that's where I think that we can look at some of the electoral results from the most recent election and say, actually, the Bitcoin voters swung things here.
Yes. I have more thoughts on that. I think I'm going to wait until we do the articles specifically on that topic, because I think that there's much to discuss there, and I look to doing so.
Don't subscribe to the podcast, folks, so you don't miss the future episode where Michael provides his thoughts on this.
Yes. So but overall, I think this is a great example of where I think we've grown a lot since the article came out, and yet I do think that as we were describing, there's a lot of very good nuggets of wisdom despite that, and so it's still nice to have this available for people to get that historical context and also see things through. What things were like in the past, what ideas held up, which kind of did not live up to expectations, and so on and so forth, which is why we're here.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you for listening to The Reorg. This podcast is brought to you by the Satoshi Nakamoto Institute, dedicated to advancing and preserving Bitcoin knowledge. Our mission is to deepen understanding and appreciation of Bitcoin, not just for today, but for generations to come, by creating enduring educational resources and generational knowledge for generational wealth. If you enjoyed the show, please support our work by sharing links, deepening your own Bitcoin knowledge by exploring and studying the SNI archives, and contributing sats. As a 501c3 nonprofit, we rely entirely on supporters like you. Whether you can give a few Satoshis or a few thousand Bitcoins, your contributions enable us to continue educating current and future Bitcoiners worldwide. And as Pierre said, be sure to subscribe, leave comments, but you can find the podcast on YouTube, on Rumble, on X, and any podcast service that you use. So enjoy and share with your friends. Thanks, Pierre.
Thank you.
you.